I want to begin by saying that I am a genuinely easygoing person. I know that everyone who tells a story like this one opens with some version of that sentence, and I understand why it sounds like a disclaimer, like I'm trying to get ahead of how I come across later in the story. But I need you to believe me, because the version of myself that existed before Richard moved in next door and the version that existed 2 years later were different enough that my wife occasionally looked at me across the dinner table with an expression I can only describe as mildly concerned. I am not someone who keeps score. I am not someone who plans. I coach my son's little league team. I make my own hot sauce and give it to people like Christmas. I am, by every reasonable measure, a person who prefers peace. Richard made peace impossible, and by the time it was over, I had learned things about patience and documentation and local municipal code that I genuinely never expected to have in my personal skill set. Let me set the scene. My wife Tanya and I bought our house 9 years ago in a mid-sized city in North Carolina. It's a quiet street, older neighborhood, the kind of place where people have lived for decades, and the social fabric is thick enough that most disputes get resolved with a conversation and a mutual willingness to not make things weird. We knew most of our neighbors within the first month. We had a good block. We had, for the first 7 years, exactly 0 problems. Richard bought the house next door 2 years ago. It had been empty for about 8 months while the estate was being settled. The previous owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, had passed away, and her family had taken time to sort out the property. We'd missed Mrs. Patterson. She used to bring Tanya sweet potato pie at Thanksgiving and call our son Marcus by the wrong name for 3 years, even after we corrected her, which was somehow endearing. When the for sale sign came down and a moving truck appeared on a Saturday in March, we did what we always do. Tanya made a pan of brownies, I walked over, knocked, and introduced myself. Richard answered the door in a way that I would come to understand was simply how Richard was, with an expression that suggested I was interrupting something important even though he was clearly just standing in an empty living room with nothing happening in it. He accepted the brownies, gave me a once-over, said his name, and closed the door. Tanya asked how it went when I came back. I told her he seemed like someone who needed a little more time to warm up. I was willing to give him that. Some people are private. Some people don't love the neighbor welcoming ritual. I wasn't going to take it personally. Over the following 3 weeks, I revised that generous interpretation several times. Richard had, it became clear almost immediately, a very specific vision for the neighborhood and an extremely low threshold for what constituted a violation of it. It started with our trash cans. Ours were kept as they had always been kept at the side of the house, near the fence, not visible from the street, not blocking anything, in the exact spot they'd lived for 7 years without a single comment from anyone. Richard knocked on our door on a Wednesday evening, 3 weeks after moving in, to inform us that our trash cans were, in his words, an eyesore and a potential code violation, and that he expected us to move them. I asked which code specifically he was referring to. He said he'd looked into it, and he was fairly certain there were municipal guidelines. I said I'd be happy to look into it too, and if there was a genuine code issue, I would absolutely address it. He stared at me for a moment and left. This, I would come to understand, was how Richard operated. Assertion without specific evidence, delivered with the confidence of someone who expected to be accommodated on tone alone. I did look into it. There was no applicable code violation. Our trash can stayed. A week later, he called the city anyway. A code enforcement officer came out, walked around, looked at the trash cans, looked at Richard, who was watching from his yard, and told me there was no violation. He looked slightly embarrassed to be there. I thanked him for his time. That was complaint number 1. Over the next 22 months, there were 10 more. He called about our fence, claiming it was 2 inches over the property line. A survey, which I paid for, which cost me $340, confirmed it was not. He called about our truck, a 2018 Ford F-150 that I park in our own driveway, claiming it was somehow obstructing something. A complaint so vague, the code enforcement office apparently had to call him back for clarification and then still found nothing actionable. He called about a birthday party we had for Marcus's 9th birthday, 20 kids in our backyard on a Saturday afternoon, claiming the noise was disruptive. The officer who responded arrived, heard the sound of 9-year-olds playing, and left within 3 minutes. He called about our garden lights. He called about a basketball hoop we had at the end of our driveway that had been there for 4 years. He filed a written complaint with our HOA. We have a loose, low-involvement HOA about the color of our mailbox post, which he claimed did not conform to neighborhood aesthetic standards. The HOA board, 3 retired people who got together twice a year and mostly just ensured the street sign was maintained, sent us a letter they looked mortified to have been required to send, and told us privately that Richard had shown up to their last informal meeting with a printed dossier. A printed dossier about our mailbox post. I want to be accurate about what those 2 years felt like to live inside, because it wasn't any single incident that wore on us. It was the accumulation, the not knowing when the next knock or the next city truck would come, the way Tanya started tensing up slightly whenever she saw Richard's car in the driveway, the way Marcus, who was old enough to notice things, asked me once why the man next door didn't like us. That question, asked by a 9-year-old in the completely matter-of-fact way that children ask hard things, is the one that shifted something in me from patient to purposeful. I was not going to move. That was the first and most important decision, and Ty and I made it explicitly out loud together after complaint number 5. Some people in our position start thinking about whether the neighborhood is worth the trouble. We had 9 years in this house. Marcus had grown up on the street. Mrs. Patterson had brought a sweet potato pie. Richard was not going to be the reason we left. So instead, I started paying attention in a different way. I had a neighbor on the other side of Richard, a retired man named Earl, who had lived on our street for 26 years and who I had always been friendly with in the easy, occasional way of good neighbors. After complaint number 6, Earl came over one evening ostensibly to return a tool he'd borrowed and stayed for an hour on my porch. And what he told me was illuminating. Richard, it turned out, had not been peaceful at his previous address either. Earl had a cousin who lived in the neighborhood Richard had moved from, a subdivision about 12 miles away. And through that cousin, Earl had learned that Richard had left his previous street under a cloud. There had been disputes there too, a property line disagreement that had escalated, complaints filed in both directions, and at some point, Earl wasn't sure the specifics, some kind of issue with the HOA in that community that had resulted in Richard selling and leaving. I thanked Earl, went inside, and opened my laptop. This is where I want to give some credit to the fact that we live in an era where a significant amount of public record is accessible to anyone willing to spend a few evenings looking. Property records, court filings, HOA lien records, which are filed with the county in most states, business registrations. I am not a lawyer or an investigator, and I was not doing anything remotely illegal. I was reading public documents, the same ones anyone could read, with the focused attention of a man who coached Little League and made hot sauce and was extremely tired of having code enforcement officers show up at his house. What I found, assembled over about 3 weeks of occasional searching, was a picture of Richard that was significantly more complicated than difficult neighbor. There had been a civil suit at his previous address, neighbor dispute, property damage claim, settled out of court. There were 2 business registrations in his name in our county, both listed as active for what appeared to be a small property management operation. And there was a lien, not large but real, filed against his current property, our neighbor's house, by a contractor for unpaid work, filed 6 weeks after he moved in, meaning Richard had hired someone to do work on the house, not paid them, and the contractor had gone to the county. I put all of this in a folder. I did not tell Richard what I knew, I did not confront him, I did not change anything about how I interacted with him, which is to say I remained civil, nodded when I saw him outside, and otherwise gave him nothing. Complaint 11 came in month 22 and was different in kind from the others. Richard had contacted not just code enforcement, but a fair housing organization, and the nature of his complaints, I learned this through the process, not in advance, contained language suggesting that our property was being maintained in a way that affected neighborhood property values. It was carefully, legally worded. It was clearly not something Richard had written without some outside guidance. And it was, for the first time in this whole saga, something that had the potential to create real procedural complications for us, even if it ultimately went nowhere. This was the moment I had been, without fully realizing it, preparing for. I called an attorney, not for the first time. I'd consulted briefly earlier in the process, but this time with purpose. I brought her my folder. Every complaint, every outcome, every date. The survey, the HOA correspondence, the research I had done on Richard's history, the contractor lien, the civil suit record from his previous address. She looked through it methodically and then looked up at me and said, "This is a pattern, and patterns are useful." She sent a letter, a formal, precise, attorney-drafted letter to Richard, to the Fair Housing Organization, and to the City Code Enforcement Office that had now fielded 11 complaints from the same address about the same property. The letter documented the complaint history in full, noted the outcome of each, 0 violations found, 11 times, and used a specific legal term I will not pretend I knew before she explained it to me: vexatious complainant. Someone who files repeated, unfounded complaints as a means of harassment. The letter stated that should a 12th complaint be filed, we would be pursuing that characterization formally and exploring all available legal remedies. It also, and this is the part I want to be careful about because I don't want to overstate it, mentioned in a single factual sentence that we were aware of the existing contractor lien on his property and of the civil matter at his previous address, and that we were prepared to provide this information to any relevant parties should legal proceedings be initiated. We were not threatening him. We were informing him, accurately, that we were not uninformed. I don't know exactly what happened next inside Richard's head or his house because I'm not interested enough in Richard to speculate. What I do know is what happened outside. The complaint stopped. A month after the letter, a for sale sign appeared in his yard. 4 months after that, he was gone. The house sat empty for a few weeks, and then a young couple moved in. Late 20s, friendly. They have a dog named Biscuit that Marcus is obsessed with. They introduced themselves on their first weekend, and Tanya made brownies, and I walked over, and they opened the door all the way and invited me in to see what they were doing with the place. It was the most normal, unremarkable neighbor interaction imaginable. I drove home. I want to say something honest about the whole experience, now that I've had distance from it. I don't feel triumphant about how it ended exactly. I feel relieved, which is different. Triumph implies I wanted a fight. I never wanted a fight. What I wanted was to be left alone in the house I'd owned for 9 years, to park my truck in my own driveway, and put my trash cans where I'd always put them, and have my son's birthday party in my backyard without a code officer showing up. What I learned is that the best response to someone who uses systems against you is to become more fluent in those systems than they are. Richard came in assuming that persistence and officiousness would wear us down. He didn't account for the possibility that we would pay attention, document carefully, and be willing to match his energy with something more organized and considerably more patient. I still make hot sauce. I gave a jar to the new neighbors last month, the couple with Biscuit. They texted me afterward to say it was the best they'd ever had, which is the correct response. Marcus and Biscuit are best friends now. The street feels like our street again. Earl came over last week and we sat on the porch, and he told me he'd heard through his cousin that Richard was already having some kind of dispute with the people across the street at his new address. I shook my head. I poured us both something cold. "Some people carry their trouble with them everywhere they go," I said. Earl nodded and said that was the truest thing he'd heard all month. We sat there for a while after that, not saying much, listening to Marcus's basketball hit the driveway in that steady, rhythmic way that means everything is exactly as it should be. It was a good evening. We've had a lot of those lately. We plan to keep having them.